Social distance remains persistent. The population is unresistant. And all the nation pleads for eternal quarantine. Yeah, they sing. Social distance, constrained affliction. The population fears every friction. And all the nation sounds for permanent lockdown. Yeah, they sing for social distancing. For social distancing. Yeah, they sing for social distancing. Caraparcel, where's the ad-libs?
I just got back from the bathroom, that's why.
Aw, shit. Okay, well that is the most infamous piece of COVID poetry currently written. Logo Daedalus's legendary lockdown ditty, or was social distancing ditty, whichever he called it. Opening our show on the poetics and politics of COVID, particularly, like, poetics, what has been written in response to the current pandemic we're living through so far. And, like I said, that's an instance of just about the worst that has been done yet. But, like, let's look at a somewhat more representative example, which, let me pull up the A.F. Moritz poem. Where did we have that?
Well, I have it open.
Oh, yeah, you have it open. Okay, you can read it, yeah. A.F. Moritz, that's Toronto's poet laureate. So, a representative of the established literature scene where we're living. Where we're recording
Poetry, TM, as they say.
Yeah. Logo sees himself as...
Let me just open my notes.
A sort of opposition to this. Much like we do, but we're hopefully doing a somewhat better job.
Yeah, I mean, instead of, like, I don't know, trying to ape rappers. I remember we were having a joke about, like, what's it called? Who'd do a better flow on the COVID ditty, either like Viper or WorldCorp Enterprise.
Oh yeah, do your Viper version. WorldCorp would not make any sense on this, as we established, but it sounds so good as a Viper rap.
Oh man.
Let me just pull up the beat again, although it's not really a Viper beat.
This is how we do. By the way. Let's see, let me open up COVID notes.
Don't you know that there's a big
YouTube ad?
Subscription is free. No joke. Free music. It's complete.
Oh. Here's a little something for the hustlers. No distance remains persistent.
27 heartbeats.
Actually, just a sec, I start that again, because I turned the beat up too high.
Damn, alright. Social distance remains persistent. The population is unresistant. And all the nation pleads for eternal quarantine. Yeah, they sing social distance. Ha-ha. Constrained affliction. The population fears every friction. And all the nation sounds for permanent lockdown. Yeah, they sing for social distancing. For social distancing. Yeah, they sing for social distancing.
Huge thanks to Mika for spending like an hour finding that ditty again for us, by the way, because the coward deleted it.
Really? He did? Oh,
yeah.
I thought it got buried under the various, like, Xi Jinping stand.
I mean, he also, like, posts so much. Like, I tracked down roughly the day he wrote it on, and I looked through all his posts from that day, and it was, like, hundreds of posts, just, like, over a couple of days.
Man, that dude's like a workhorse in the affect economy, man.
Yeah.
Did we want to talk a little bit about about this poem in particular before going into A.F. Moritz's, or do you want me to just like jump into A.F. Moritz's?
I mean, there's not really much to say about it. I think it stands best on its own. I think the Moritz is more like amenable to criticism and more relevant criticism to any of the things we're going to be talking about on the rest of this show.
Fair enough, yeah, because like one of the things we want to talk about was kind of like these poems, kind of as the psychogram of just like what people think of for the pandemic and what I guess logos, despite how simplistic it is, what it might be representative of. But I guess we can do that after, considering what we also got coming in store. Okay, so actually, wait, since you're on Twitter, I mean, we could post these like on like a comment thread, kind of connected to the stream.
I'll do that later.
I mean, if you want to, you could post.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do that later.
All right. Because this one, later, sure.
Yeah. This one's called "Thoughts in Time of Plague." Hopefully, it actually goes through. Let's see. When we set out, we knew many would die on the way, and yet the journey was joyous. When we made our home, we knew many would die there, and yet we loved that house, all the views from its windows we named Beauty. When we went down the road, the light was different every mile. What could be behind those mute windows, with sometimes a peering eye? What pleasure in those almost empty gardens? What unknown work in the factories, birds in the dense wood? When dawn came in our bedroom, we woke too late in the old shattered kitchen amid food scraps, empty bottles. Didn't our memory burn deeper, the same old scar, flaming anew, shifting, unmoved? And when we were trembling by the sick that we loved and feared so many, was it different, whether on the road with nowhere to lay them down, or in the road with nowhere else to take them? When we had to watch the threatened breathing or leave it to go to work, when we had to hear they had died without us, was it different? No different, except that we saw something we always knew in the dark. Failure was not an end, and success had never been the end. The end was care.
Yeah. So.
Let's.
Yeah. What do you think of it?
Yeah, just as a quick disclaimer, I kind of feel bad that I'm gonna rag on A.F. Moritz a little bit, because I remember seeing this dude read at Jabby Share a while back, and he was writing about catastrophe as well, or at least like a particular kind of catastrophe. I believe it was related to the Nagasaki bombings.
That's interesting context, actually, because I feel like a lot of not a lot of poetry about this is necessarily coming from people with a broader sort of perspective on catastrophe, although certainly, like, say, anyone who's doing, like, eco-poetics or something right now, like, that's gotta be a similar kind of affect and similar, political, tightrope to walk. Like...
Yeah, especially I think... Sorry, go on.
No, keep going.
Oh, just especially just because I guess at the time it was written, or even a little bit before that, I guess the shadow of I guess the literal shadows of the atomic bomb, as well as like the looming modernity that came afterward, is still kind of something that's still looming across people today, in the sense of this kind of mass precariousness that the atom bomb provides, in the sense of, like, I think anyone could be could be like obliterated or lose their job or lose everything.
And also this
but then again,
very
that's kind of what we're going
particular
through right
sort
now,
of
right?
politics of management of precariousness. Like the fact that you have an international geopolitical order now founded on the principle of mutually assured destruction, in the same sense as you now have a sort of like increasingly like total kind of biopolitical system founded on COVID risk management, the sort of lockdown system we evolved over the past year, and the potentially vaccine passports, etc., that we might bring in over the next.
Not to mention the the random rumors like COVID making sex illegal and anti-sex beds.
I mean, that was
which,
not
I
like
found out recently.
that was not a rumor. That was a rhetorical move by someone I don't fully agree with, but I'll get around to. Well, oh no, there was that fucking rumor. You're right. There was fucking there was all these goofy headlines like government policy about like orgies or whatever in England. That was one of the weird like clickbait trends of the mid-pandemic that I completely forgot about.
Yeah, as well as the recent Japanese anti-sex beds, which were apparently it's apparently not true, but the more interesting thing is kind of how that rumor like snowballed entirely, like not just in I guess the like online circle where people were just going, haha, no sex on Maine.
Well, yeah, and it deeply relates to stuff I'm going to come back to at probably a couple of points in this podcast. But yeah, I just meant more the extent to which there's these sort of like international risk management regimes, also the transformation of border regimes, which like I'd say hasn't been as violent as one would have expected, but I'm also like, yeah, what happened to all the like refugee stories that was like everywhere for the last 4 years? Like, what was happening with COVID in the refugee camps in Europe? I'd never heard anything about this, and now I need to look it up.
Maybe we'll add it as an addendum to the end of the podcast if you find something.
No, there was a bunch of stuff I wanted
to
do more research on. I wanted to do more research on AIDS when you called. I was like in the middle of reading an article about the bathhouse closures in San Francisco, which also relates to what we were just talking about. But anyway, what did you think of the Moritz poem?
Yeah. So when I read it, I mean, quality wise, there wasn't anything where I'm just like, why does this have to happen? Like it didn't elicit a sense of like with Logo's COVID ditty, it's kind of like I go into cognitive dissonance where I'm just like, is this ironic? But at the same time, having this as a COVID poem kind of like doesn't really capture like the scale or the I guess the subtleties of I suppose being within not just like isolation, but being socially isolated, as well as just like how the world has changed both like visually and internally. But with A.F. Moritz's poem, I felt like it was sliding to a different scale, where it felt a lot more like it was poetry in the sense that a marketer would think of poetry. Because check it, right? So whenever people think of poetry, they think of they have this like nostalgic image of the little cottage in the rural areas, taking in this like sense of serene and peace, the same kind of serene and peace that people advertise all the time in say what would you call it? I'm saying like a billboard. Like, let's say if you're driving, I don't know, in Wasega or
Cottagecore
Muskoka,
TikTok, if you want to move it more into new media, like...
Yeah, I mean, hell, like just like look at the images. Like half the images of this is purely just like I'm not gonna I'm not gonna bash on the technique per se. Like the technique is relatively fine, if not just like a little bit, kind of like trying to be Ocean Vuongy, like trying to bring like
not feel Ocean
poeticness
Vuongy, but yeah, you're right about poetic diction, kind of what I think we're gesturing towards.
I mean, the gesture. That's a better way to put it, because it's not like it feels like it's preparing to be in the mode of a poetic voice, but not fully like being in that poetic voice. Especially with like lines like, "When we made our home, we knew many would die there, and yet we loved that house. All the views from its windows we named beauty." Like there's a restraint in those lines, but at the same time, it feels a bit hackneyed. I mean, I remember
it's this weird image of almost the pioneer home. Like it feels like Little House on the Prairie or something in that little section. You're right, and I didn't even notice that about it, but that's something that's all over the Book of American COVID poetry that I read to get more context on this.
Really? Even extended there too? Huh.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's... Yeah, you'd kind of think it might be a Canlit thing, because Canlit has this whole, like, rural mythology, and, American stuff, on the other hand, like, literally half the people in this book, or something, I think, are from New York, but, like, no, it is very similar. And I think it's specifically... I mean, in Canlit, it's kind of always like this, but in America, I think you specifically had people retreating to that imagery, that register, in response to COVID. And, yeah. So, yeah, the interesting thing about the Moritz to me, and why I retweeted it on our account at one point, asking, like, does this have, like, a Ford administration feel or not, is, like, there's this weird sort of, like, resigned fatalism to it, and also this sort of, like, the no different thing. Like, on one hand, like, this being not... COVID not being fundamentally different from sort of everyday tragedy is, like, a relief, like, it's, like, true relative to some of the stuff we'll be talking about later, some of these sort of early pandemic, like, feverish predictions from people like Berardi, about how it's going to, like, fundamentally change the human condition and collapse capitalism and everything. But it's also, like, an almost denialist position, and a position that backs out of the poetic responsibility of saying anything about its specific historical circumstances by just sort of elevating it into the most general possible terms of acceptance of death, where you have no agency whatsoever over who dies and how, and what other things are sacrificed to prevent what kinds of suffering, and everything that the entire politics of the pandemic has been about. And it's sort of, and specifically, like, there's lines where it specifically invokes, like, what unknown work in the factories, like, when we had to watch the threatened breathing or leave it to go to work, like, the fact of, for instance, a lot of industries remaining open because the economy had to remain open in specific ways in specific capitalist forms is just completely unquestioned and taken as just as sort of like just as natural and given as like when we set out we knew many would die on the way and yet the journey was joyous, which is just like life in total. But also as like an approach to the pandemic, like, well, we knew X amount of people were going to die. And again, like, I've been very skeptical of the impulse to, like, pretend to be Emi Ishiro and Fate Stay Night throughout this, where people are like, it's not acceptable if even one person dies. Like, you are not Emi Ishiro, you are not going to jump in front of a fucking, like, servant with superpowers to protect one person. You are largely going to pretend nobody is dying when you don't hear about it on the news and say, it's not acceptable for even one person to die on my Twitter timeline. But, like, that said, there is still, like, a degree of moral responsibility, even if you are making decisions of how many people have to die. It's not the same to me as just we knew many would die on the way. There is more to it than that.
Yeah, actually, I actually didn't even think of that. That kind of like avoidance of talking about the pandemic directly, as well as just like the romanticization of factories, especially because now that you mentioned Berardi, like Berardi mentioned that Anecto, where I think there was a village in Italy that had a I think a steel plant or some kind of like metalworking plant whose emissions were essentially toxic and was a health hazard. But the only reason why they didn't close the factory was because workers protested against it, and the most notable line from it was someone saying, "Hey, it's better to have cancer than to be unemployed."
Yeah! Actually, there was a crazy thing I remember reading early in the pandemic where, like, there was that one region of Italy that was just hit way harder than everywhere else. And somebody was asking, like, why is it so much worse here in terms of how many people are dying than anywhere else? And one of the reasons someone suggested was there was just so much air pollution in that region. It was one of the heavily industrialized still regions of northern Italy, and people were getting hit with these, like, lung, this lung inflammation from the disease on lungs that were already really just damaged from all the air pollution. Which I'm not sure how much that makes sense, because it doesn't quite check out with how much relatively better things went in China, where air pollution is insane, but...
Right, yeah. Yeah, the smog is so that you can really see much in front of you.
Yeah.
Let's see. The region is called Taranto. A woman from Toronto told a journalist, better to die of cancer than of hunger.
Yeah. Which was
if you have Hero...
Yeah. I'd say that was a big sort of...
Yeah, Heroes Open, it's on page...
Yeah. I would have said that was a big sort of factor underlying the anti-lockdown sentiment throughout the first while of the pandemic, but now that that's transitioned to, like, anti-vax and, like, anti-mask and stuff like that, it seems like something else is going on.
Also, is it coincidental that the chapter that Berardi talks about the steel plant is called Suicidal Wave? Well, then again, the entire chapter is pretty much about things like about Monsanto, Foxconn, essentially people killing themselves for labor because like labor and I guess like because like in a lot of Berardi's work he talks about the deterritorialization between the person and labor, like the person is now inextricable from labor.
Yeah.
Which I guess like has now come in kind of like very reactive forms, like what you were talking about with like anti-vaccination. I mean, especially with like I spat on my phone. With the kind of health rhetoric where it's like, oh, it's going to get in the way of health, but then that's also underpinning the kind of idea of health as optimization in the way of like, if I'm like healthy, I can, for example, continue to work, i.e., like other labors, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I
Anyway,
want to go back to something real quick because
Yeah.
you talked about. Sorry, yeah.
no, keep going.
I want to go back to something where you talked about restraint, especially. We've had a lot of conversations off air about what is it that the poetry brand is, in a sense of like in terms of the cultural industry, because with with the COVID ditty, I mean, I think it's very clear that it's not trying to be like poetry in the sense of like what you find at Indigo or Barnes and Noble or something.
It's trying to
in the
be
arts and
rap
letters
is
section.
what it's trying to be.
Wait, it's trying what? Sorry,
It's
I didn't
trying to
catch
be
that.
rap is what it's trying to be, which is sort of the people's poetry right now. And it would actually, we
Right,
didn't do this at all, but we should have looked up to see if like what rap has come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, true. Especially with what would the moniker pandemic type beat even sound like?
Yeah.
Like, what's the sound that makes like it sounds like pandemic? Like, is it just like a reinvention of trap beats or something that sounds more clinical? IDK, bro.
Yeah. Pandemic type beat is the free beat that I used for when we did the ditty, just for anyone listening. But yeah, you were saying.
But anyway, yeah, we talked about. Yeah, when we talk about off air a lot, what the poetry brand is like especially like for I guess for millennials, right? There's a lot of relatable kind of poetry, or at least a strive to be relatable, among other things. Whereas like people think of poetry, they think of this like this kind of fragmented kind of prose with a kind of like moral at the end. I mean, especially because like think back to like way back in the day, right? Like when we were kids, we thought about when we were taught poetry, we're usually taught like, oh, it's got like a nice little rhyme and it's got like a little like moral or meaning at the end of it. And that model stays with a lot of people for a while, because when people think about poetry, right, other than the still surprisingly glamored feel of, oh, like, as they say in theory for the young girl, my boyfriend's a poet kind of thing, and then also kind of instrumentality of it. I mean, even the end of the poem is like it sort of sums up all of the poem's like poetic intention, in a sense. Like even the last four lines rather, is except that we saw something we always knew, rhetorical, in the dark, failure was not, and success had never been the end. The end was care. Like the end was care is supposed to be like the punchline, in a sense.
Yeah.
For that section, and to me, that kind of encapsulates exactly like the poetry cultural machine, especially for not just for like catastrophe, but just in general. Like I remember I used the kind of catch-all where I was like, oh, they kind of sound like Hallmark, Hallmark cards or something. I remember you were talking about like the worst of Ocean Vuong sounding like it came from the Doki Doki Literature Club poem creator.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing there is the way you're describing sort of the poetry formula you learn in school. That's sort of like almost the rhyme and the morals of that's almost like a holdover, sort of the Victorian academic poetry formula that was disrupted by modernism. And what we've gotten since the decline of high modernism has become this sort of slightly tweaked version of, and what I got like 100 examples of in Together in a Sudden Strangeness, America's Poets Respond to the Pandemic, the book which I took out from the library to put this and the few COVID poems I've seen in context, is like a slightly tweaked version of the sort of pre-modern academic formula, which is like, it's not necessarily rhyming or metered, but it's a very sort of like rhythmically, quasi-metrically careful free verse. Like a sort of free verse where the lines are like a roughly similar sound, and like if you sort of, like if you did like a scansion mark, there would be something going on, and it would be something kind of slow and lilting, but not really in a strict format. And instead of a moral that's like a definitive, prescriptive, like moral statement in the sense that you had them under like hegemonic Christianity with a fully realized moral worldview and a teleology and a cosmology. What you have is this sort of, like, the term that is used in short fiction a lot of the time, and it's essentially the same term used in poetry, is an epiphany. But the epiphany is something, and here's the thing, like, the range of them, like, it's always something a little ambiguous, and it's, like, just this sort of thought that, like, touches on a broader topic or a more universal theme, but, like, doesn't say anything sort of definitive or final about it, and... But increasingly, I'm noticing, given the sort of, there's a sort of philosophical unimaginativeness to the sort of contemporary poetry world in particular, and literary world, partly because, I mean, on one hand, like, in philosophy, there's not much, and religion and morality, there's not much new really happening as someone who studies theory in those fields. But also, poets are no longer even expected to be conversant in that. So on one hand, there's like a cultural forefront of, like, thought on these kinds of issues, on, like, what it would mean, what something like care means, on what, ethical responsibility towards death is. And there's no sort of, like, mainstream universal morality. All the work is happening in almost a specialist field. But there's also no requirement or expectation for poets to even be conversant in the specialist conversation, or in, like, even really the discourse beyond how it reaches you on, again, like a kind of average Twitter feed. So the reason stuff sounds like Hallmark is that the sort of MFA ideology of poets are not supposed to, like, engage with abstract thought or abstract ideas. They are supposed to just sort of observe and draw insight directly from life. But also, most of these people are not like Samuel Delaney or Yukio Mishima going out there having, like, really unique and interesting lives. In fact, most of them do very little with their lives other than write and teach poetry. So ultimately, this sort of engagement with the universal, the moral dimension that's required by the format, but as an epiphenomenon to a poetics that is fundamentally about sort of pure craft, ends up just reproducing cliches of the culture industry and reproducing this very kind of like limited agnosticism where you can't really say much of anything about anything. And you were just sort of like stuck to saying like life's a big mystery, love is the answer. When politics comes up, there's a line from one of the poems in here that this guy might have a much more serious politics than this. In fact, he's known as a somewhat political poet, so I don't want to knock him too much. Again, same probably with Moritz, like writing about the atomic bomb. He's probably thought about that in a lot more depth than he has about this, maybe. But, like, just this line from Jericho Brown's Say Thank You, Say I'm Sorry, which is far more political and far more cutting than Moritz's, and has almost opposite politics to Moritz's in all the senses that I was complaining about. But this center line, and it's just like, I'm in a mood about America today. Like, that's sort of the kind of political range you're left with by the MFA poetic format. And again, I'm not sure there's, like, an easy alternative to this of just, like, be more political in the, like, paint bucket mag sense, because that just sort of ends up with your poems sounding like Twitter, but like politics junkie Twitter instead of normie Twitter. Like, there should be a way that poetic form generates something unto itself. But that does not seem in these discourses, but that does not seem to be what is happening most of the time here. Especially not in the pandemic poems I've read. Now, which very, very closely stuck to the format I was sort of describing. I found out about this book through a New York Times article called A Raging Pandemic Inspires Poetry with Little Bite. And, like, the way it's describing it is, let me see. Much of the tepid free verse is about flowers, or birds, or trees. Harold Ross, when he edited The New Yorker, was wise to rage against tree poems. I do not rage against tree poems. I write tree poems a lot. I've kind of been writing them more this past year because, like, I've been going out in the woods a lot more, because I'm not wandering around the city, like, stopping at 3 different coffee shops in a day like I used to. Like, that's a very understandable thing to do and to happen. I didn't actually find it even as nature-y as that, but it is very, in the sense that you described the Moritz poem as being kind of like cottagecore pastoralist. A lot of it is just in its register of imagery. A lot of it is that, and a lot of it is essentially like just noticing something, some sort of quiet thing going on around your house, essentially, or the woods you're near, and then connecting it to something, in, like, some sort of general insight about the pandemic. I actually wrote a poem of this exact format myself, and I like to think that the one I wrote is, in some sense, an auto-critique of the genre, but also an exploration of why it works here and what it means. I called it Quarantine Forest, but now that I look, that's an absolutely dogshit name, and I'm going to change the name. I'm probably going to keep monkeying around with this poem for a while, but, for anyone who didn't hear this on our Omegle reading, which you can scroll down our timeline and watch just to see us flail around and get, like, dropped by dozens of people after like 15 seconds of reading poetry on Omegle. Where the dead stand in ranks with the living cannot stand without lifting the dead, and let them lean with the same camaraderie as if they could get up. They speak the same language of creaks and groans, suffer the same lichens and storms, are rearranged by the same, like unattended toys. One limb might belong to one world, one to the other, locked, intertwined with the other again. The eyes must follow any trunk to the tips of the branches where the buds crouch like bombs, to see if this great white elephant's foot, that lightning-blackened ogre's spit, this spring-loaded net of teeth, that petrified thunderbolt, is alive or dead. Alive or dead is the question, not death. Death is an answer read by the roots themselves in the dead, dense pages of the soil. The answer is only a comfort when you are alone. And what I meant by that, the answer is only a comfort when you are alone, is sort of a response to, like, I think of this poem in a way as my, like, it's a guilt-driven poem in a way, and it's a response to, like, one of my favorite poems of all time, and I think it is one of the poems that, like, works really well as a COVID poem without being about that, particularly in response to what I was reading in Moritz, the kind of, like, we knew many would die along the way affect. It's a Gerald Stern poem called Behaving Like a Jew, and I just want to read this. When I got there, the dead opossum looked like an enormous baby sleeping on the road. It took me only a few seconds, just seeing him there, with the hole in his back and the wind blowing through his hair, to get back again into my animal sorrow. I am sick of the country, the blood-stained bumpers, the stiff hairs sticking out of the grills, the slimy highways, the heavy birds refusing to move. I am sick of the spirit of Lindbergh over everything, that joy in death, that philosophical understanding of carnage, that concentration on the species. I am going to be unappeased at the opossum's death. I am going to behave like a Jew and touch his face and stare into his eyes and pull him off the road. I am not going to stand in a wet ditch with the Toyotas and the Chevys passing over me at 60 miles an hour and praise the beauty and balance, and lose myself in the immortal life stream when my hands are still a little shaky from his stiffness and his bulk, and my eyes are still weak and misty from his round belly and his curved fingers, and his black whiskers and his little dancing feet. That to me is the ultimate, like, I don't want to let even one person die poem, and it's, like, I'm constantly pulled between that and sort of, like, I mean, him and my other favorite poet is, like, Ted Hughes. And in the pandemic one I wrote, I was sort of, like, struggling with why that relation to death as just sort of ubiquitous and continuous with life is appealing to me in the specific moment of the pandemic. And it's not just the fact that death is there that makes that appealing. It's the fact that, like, I was otherwise extremely isolated at that point, and, like, this was early lockdown, I was at home, like, there was no way to see people even in a distanced way. I was also going through the kind of, like, psychotic episode that premised on, like, solipsistic anxieties I was having last year, and the comfort of that, of the forest, to me was very much that this continuity with death is also a continuity with others. and it's a continuity with others that is completely, like, independent of any form of sort of communication, of elective affinities, of, like, deliberate sociality. It's just like the biosphere is already, and death itself is already a kind of companionship in it. And you're not faced with this, like, terror of loneliness that is part of the modern condition and also part of specifically the pandemic condition, specifically the modern pandemic condition, which COVID was. And it's that modern pandemic condition that precisely COVID poets seem to be running away from into this pastoral fantasy, even at the same time as this pastoral fantasy was their image of the isolation and lockdown that was a condition of the modern pandemic that did not happen in previous historical pandemics. People will, like, say that, like, the 1918 Spanish flu, like, there were similar measures, like, certain things were closed, there were masks, etc. But, like, you did not have a total shutdown of, I mean, it wasn't really a total shutdown, but a shutdown of essentially the entire sort of, the so-called non-essential economy, which is a very interesting category. Like, that would not have even been possible then, because essentially we didn't have the technology for it. So yeah, that's, like, my, in a sense, that's my, like, most charitable reading of what's going on with COVID pastoralism. I also have an uncharitable reading of it, which derives from a poem in this book. I wrote down a bunch of poems as, like, this book is overall strictly mid. Like, very few of the poems are flat out bad. They all have nice turns of phrase. They're all well crafted. They're all at their best when they're just talking about, like, trees and flowers and birds, frankly, because anyone with a human soul can find, like, cool things to say about trees and flowers and birds. It's easier than engaging with the meaning of death, and frankly, if that's what you're most interested in, I advise you stick to it. But here's one of the ones that the New York Times review actually referred to as one of the good ones, and which to me was, like, it's called The New Nice by Danielle Chapman, and it's, like, one of the good ones for being, like, snarky and negative and not Hallmark cardy, but I don't think you have to be Hallmark cardy to be, well, petty bourgeois and culture industry inflected, which, in fact, the Hallmark card
Don't
is
you mean
this...
irony poisoned?
Irony poisoned is a... Very little in this book is irony poisoned. In fact, I'd say nothing in this book is irony poisoned, because this book is almost entirely written by boomers. There's, like, one...
Right.
There's a few millennials in it, and there's one poem that, like, I can tell is millennial by the writing, because it basically reads like alt-lit. There's a very funny...
Oh, right.
There's, like, Catherine Cohen's poem I wrote after I asked you if cereal can expire is the token alt-lit pandemic poem. And it's pretty cringe. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. Let me see if I can, like, just find some bad lines in it.
Check or cringe.
I I used to worry. No, it just opens with there's a pandemic and I think my arms are fat. I used to worry I had vaginismus, but it turns out I just wasn't attracted to my ex. I put the wrong kind of gas in the car and hate being alone. Yeah. Pandemic alt-lit. But anyway, the one I wanted to talk about was Danielle Chapman, The New Nice, which is, it's not a Hallmark card, it's like, you know those cards with, like, the edgy grandma?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I still consider those Hallmark cards, or at least they share the same shelf with the Dollar
yeah,
Store.
that's precisely what I'm saying. Like, it is, like, whoever was writing the New York Times criticism was just like, yeah, these poems are all too Hallmark. I wish they were more like this edgy grandma poem, or like Happy Bunny, or whatever. But Danielle Chapman, The New Nice, which I will read in full because I think it is extremely, like, paradigmatic of another sort of pandemic politics, goes, catastrophe closes us into the house. What I thought an aimless brick suburban tutor becomes clear utterance. It says no wherever I would have said yes. No longer must I be nice to anyone except the people in this house. Niceness, it is obvious to me now, lets out what should be hemmed. It mists lawns and portions of pavement. It spends, and it spends on acquaintances. It pretends an open face, an open personality, as a bad boss described mine once, an invitation. What am I saying? A sunny day, bicycling neighbor gangs, loud boys playing not quite 6 feet away mean to harass this house. That's not very nice. But this is my property. I've decided these daffodils or tulips are mine to keep or kill. Perennials rage up every May along this edge, an edge I would prefer you keep your doggy off. I'm tired of speaking in telephone voice. May I please speak to so-and-so? No. I'm closing the door now. It sticks, but once it gives, it locks with an important click. And, like, that's an image of, like, that's presented in opposition to the pandemic pastoralism, but it's about what the pandemic pastoralism is all predicated on, which is the ownership of property and the rights of the owner of property, which fundamentally the whole sort of image of, like, this retreating into this peaceful, isolated hermitage life in lockdown was predicated on, like, ownership of property, on owning a house in the suburbs, which the value of went up, like, probably 50% of over the pandemic, and then also BlackRock is gonna buy up en masse, and, like, that you can, not, that you can just do, that you can work from entirely, that, you don't interact with anyone else regularly, just in going in and out of, in doing your laundry, etc. Like, in where the pandemic was actually spreading, where people were most affected by it, was, like, people in, like, renting in small, tight apartments, people who might have gotten evicted from their apartments if the eviction ban had not been put in place, and might get evicted from them now that is expiring. And people in stuff like long-term care homes, where you do not have any of this autonomy over your living situation, and you are crammed in with tons of people who you have to negotiate every sort of, every, like, minutiae of your daily routine with day in, day out. And you may or may not be nice, like, about it. The poem appropriates this sort of, like, feminist rage against, like, enforced, niceness and prosociality and emotional labor, which is all well and good by itself, but then imposes the violent relation of property and enclosure as its image of, like, emancipatory autonomy, which to me is just fundamentally wrong and perverse, especially in a pandemic in which so many people have been locked out of things they need by this very institution, in which people were on the street and, like, some people would try to build tiny homes for the homeless in Toronto and were prevented from doing this because those were on public property or private property, and in which there was private property sitting completely unoccupied, where in Hong Kong, for instance, they turned unoccupied apartment buildings into isolation centers for people with COVID who could not, again, isolate in your completely, like, your suburban house with a white picket fence around it that you can kick the neighbors off the lawn of, and when they got sick, they could at least be moved to a place in some of this property that is not being used for anything. We did not do that here. Like, at some point, we rented hotels, which is just, like, kind of hilariously, kind of hilariously just like the government acting like a normal person. Like, it's not like I'm the government or anything. I can't just, like, requisition any of this property. I have to just, like, buy a hotel room like I'm some guy.
The government is a slave to
Yeah. I guess there's one insofar as this.
I'll just wait for
another poem I wanted to read.
Yeah, keep going.
That there's one called "The End of Poetry" by Ada Limon. That's, like, also, I guess, an auto-critique of this sort of poetry. That's, like, more direct and to the point than mine. But I guess I'll just read. That also takes this, rather than taking this sort of pastoral sense of poetry as, like, rendered more relevant by COVID, and in some sense sort of returned, like, there's almost a sense in a lot of these that, like, oh, suddenly we're noticing the little things again, we're noticing the trees and flowers and birds, because we're isolated, we're able to see the role of poetry and the role of the essential poetic topics and poetic diction again, in the sense of, like, the nature is returning boomer memes. And then on the other hand, you have Ada Limon, who wrote The End of Poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot, enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy and the stoic farmer and faith and our father and 'tis of thee, enough of bosom and bud, skin and God, not forgetting and star bodies and frozen birds, enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing, enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up, enough of the gun, the drama and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser, enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of the ego, enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child, and enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate, enough of the brutal and the border, enough of can you see me, can you hear me, enough I am human, enough I am alone and I am desperate, enough of the animal saving me, enough of the high water, enough sorrow, enough of the air and its ease, I am asking you to touch me. Which, of course, the last thing in this, and it's an appeal that comes up at the end of quite a number of poems here, is what cannot be done in the pandemic. And, yeah, I'm kind of awkwardly trying to make a transition here. But another thing, like, the flip side of this, pastoral mode, though, and this is the other, like, major thing I noticed about this book, is that there's very little in it that talks about the pandemic itself directly. Like, the basic mode is retreating from some sort of observation, social or natural, of isolation and lockdown to some sort of universal observation about mortality or care or something like that. There's very little actual sickness, actual death, actual, like, there's occasional politics, but, I mean, nothing about the reason. There's, like, a ton of lockdown, a ton of quarantine, very little, like, actual pandemic, the reason any of this is happening. Which is, like, one of the things, just a sec, let me get a cough drop, and then I'll launch onto my second big rant.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll just say in the intervening time, I can't believe that that we finally have a poetry equivalent of stop posting about COVID poems. I'm tired of seeing it. My MFA program says poems on literary mix poems. I was in a server, right, and all the text was about COVID poems. I show my I think an example for that, but man.
Anyway, it had me thinking about a tweet from somebody who tweeted this again. It was somebody people were making fun of because they're one of the, like, post-left kind of accounts who's become, like, a right-wing COVID denialist. And that was the subtext that was being read into the tweet. But it's a fundamentally correct take, even if you don't, like, take that away from it. It was from, just a second. It's not coming up. Oh, yes, Egg God at Sweet Egg Person, said, COVID is the first TV disease. Many of us know more about it from watching the popular media channels than from talking to people who got it or from getting it ourselves. And as we know, poets aren't really, not a lot of poets are sure how to write about media itself directly. Like, nobody gets, like, there's a lot of poems in here that, like, refer to scrolling Twitter or watching the news constantly, but, like, none of the poems try to capture the affect of that. The affect is always outside it. But yeah. And I think one of the other peculiar things about COVID poetry is one of the peculiar things about it as a modern pandemic, where, again, this lockdown thing happened in a way that it couldn't at any previous point in history, which, to some extent, contained the disease in ways that would have been impossible at any previous point in history, although they also eliminated one of the vital literary and symbolic and effective functions of a disease, of a epidemic disease, since like the Middle Ages, which has been as like the great leveler. This idea that like no matter your station in life, like death comes to you equally, disease comes to you equally, you are going to get the fucking Black Plague or Spanish flu. As everyone's pointed out, there are these huge inequalities in who was affected by COVID, and that is primarily not people who are poets in America, and is like dependent heavily on the lockdown, on the sort of conditions, also dependent on just like healthcare and stuff, but also dependent very heavily on this strange compromise the West reached over like what parts of the economy were deemed essential, and like not so much like just the parts, because obviously like food production needed to keep occurring, but what forms of economy were deemed essential, as in you were still getting your food at the grocery store, or if you are like unbelievably posh like several people in this book, getting everything delivered to you. Like, as opposed to in China, where, like, literally the government would come to your door in fucking hazmat suits and deliver you, like, rations for a week. Which was a situation that basically everyone in Wuhan or wherever was in, regardless of class, as far as I'm aware. It's not like you had a class that was ordering Uber Eats every day, and a class that was, working the cash, but this class divide is just the particular capitalist manifestation of what is, I think, a modern paradox of disease that's being revealed by this lockdown, that's, like, that goes deeper than just the capitalist hypocrisy and inequality, which is precisely that, like, because we have been, in many ways, successfully containing it, people do not have, at the sort of level of affect and direct experience that informs poetry, that informs particularly the sort of school of life-based, observational poetry that is encouraged in the American MFA, which I'm not even opposed to or hostile to. It is roughly what I write, unless I'm doing my Denpa shit. That people do not have any such experience related to the disease. People do not have a shared experience of the disease. The only shared experience is the sort of shared experience of lockdown, but as we established, that's already a somewhat class-gated shared experience, and it's also a shared experience that, like, outside of the getting out in the woods and baking bread part, is extremely heavily mediated by the culture industry, by Twitter, by Netflix, and by these things that kind of mediate and inhibit the kinds of direct interpersonal connection that are supposed to arise out of a shared trauma. That, in fact, it has become somewhat impossible to form a shared trauma. That, and there were a lot of platitudes throughout the pandemic that, like, oh, like being apart is bringing us closer together. Like we're really coming to connect more and appreciate each other in each other's absence. Frankly, I think the fact that people are now living in completely different worlds where half of them don't even think the pandemic is happening because they don't trust the stuff they're seeing on TV and or do trust the stuff they're seeing on their algorithm generated Facebook or Twitter feed is just the most direct and complete disproof of that idea. That no, this sort of like artificial mediated distance is not, at least the way we're using it now, and there could be like a different way of using it. That's where poets would have to engage with the internet, is not actually substituting for intimacy and the kind of intimacy, even in trauma, that the kind of intimacy that allows people to process trauma, the kind of intimacy that allows people to turn it into art, like Delaney's Tale of Plagues and Carnivals, which we're going to get to later in this. I think it's very interesting in that analogy. This is going to be the first time we brought up the sex thing before, and just to use a somewhat far out analogy or connect it to a broader dimension, when you said the sex thing, the like sex illegal thing, where I went to was again yet another tweet from like a weird COVID skeptic who I'm not fully endorsing on here, but Molly Klein, aka Red Kahina, who said back in like March or something 2020, that if AIDS had happened now under the sort of under the discursive regime we have around COVID and the norms we formed around lockdown, etc., we would have made sex illegal. And the funny thing is that resonates with a sense in which we're not doing that because of disease, but like there's been this collapse in sex that's happening for tons of reasons right now, and it's something that I've never been entirely convinced is a bad thing entirely, because it's happening coincident to a moment in which we're realizing how much compulsory sexuality in our culture has been a source of trauma, and also coincident with the internet making it less necessary for a lot of people, and in fact less even appealing as you retreat into any given sort of like hyper online niche fantasy. And there is this partly ethical and partly affective trade-off between intimacy and trauma that is enabled by the technology of mediated substitutes for intimacy. And this allows us to, like, open ethical questions that were not even questions for much of history. This idea that, again, the sort of Emi Ashiro thing, like, can we let even one person die? Again, through much of history, this was simply not a question that it was even meaningful to ask. It was like the A.F. Moritz poem, it was an act of God. It was simply your time comes when it comes, and death is the great leveler, and you process the collective trauma through acts of social intimacy like the danse macabre. And instead, what you have here is, in these collective traumas that are spread precisely by the act of collectivity and intimacy, you have the option now to retreat entirely into yourself and isolation and technological mediation, which is, in many ways, a retreat from poetry. Are you still there? Which is a retreat from the traditional matter of literature, the subject matter of literature, apart from at least this natural pastoral mode of literature, which is in itself, as in the one I wrote, simply a substitute for the social and for intimacy. And just simply allowing the natural world outside the human to exist in this sort of like tragic continuity with death that as the human you are avoiding and walling out of your property. So that is essentially the paradox of COVID poetics, not pandemic poetics as as opposed to pandemic poetics as a broader historical phenomenon, but precisely the poetics of COVID as the first fully modern pandemic, as a sort of paradox of the morality of solipsism, which everyone seems to shy away from addressing directly or from trying to reach out across and fight against. Although one of my favorite poems in this book, and this will be the last one I read, that does, and I'm being kind of uncharitable about all of this. When I mentioned this theme to Dorian, my boyfriend, he was just like, yeah, like probably a lot of people don't want to deal with it really directly just yet, which might be true. So I will wait and see if, like in the coming years, we get a lot of like AIDS or 1918 flu-esque sort of grapplings with COVID trauma in itself, as opposed to this sort of weird half-life of lockdown. But that makes it even more impressive that, what's his name? No, her name. Elizabeth Spires wrote Unwinding the Wound, which does actually try to touch on the universality of suffering, rather than like really as a fact in itself. Only happiness is shared, and anger, and the idea of love. A reply to Auden's surgical ward. Unwinding the wound, gazing through gauze at the pure place, the patient prone, as layer upon layer is peeled and pulled away, pain's province exposed and entered. Life is lived here, at the center, on the edge of the pure place that pulses and throbs, a privilege, a terrible privilege, to be refused, embraced, to be one with the suffering one. Finally a finality, a hand letting go of a hand, the suffering of one at an end while the other must suffer and go on. No prayer will put an end to this, but still we pray the prayer prayed once in a garden. Let this pain pass, Lord. Oh, let it pass. But anyway, that was a bit of a digression because I wanted to move from the sort of morality of solipsism and paradox of lockdown I was describing to someone I think who has theorized something similar to this, who you read more of than I did, which is Berardi, who wrote COVID Diaries for the first couple of months of the pandemic from Italy, which is where it was really starting and getting bad before everywhere else, where it still kind of got worse than it did in most places, or at least more directly experienceable in terms of, like, the hospitals overflowing, trucks carrying bodies to be buried, etc., like a medieval plague. And, like, yeah, what does he have to say about this?
Let's see. Well, before I get into that, one thing I want to touch on, actually, just to close out the previous point, is that it's interesting you mentioned, the government classification of, essential and non-essential business, because with the pandemic, we sort of see this kind of instrumentality of poetry. Like, all of a sudden, it seemed like at the time, or at least now, it's like, oh, like, why now does poetry have like a sort of spotlight? Is it because poetry offered some kind of like relief? I guess, like, was that the kind of service that it provided? And so that was kind of what made me think of like, your favorite philosopher, one of Theodore Adorno's idea of the almost always like misquoted thing where he said that that it was impossible to write poetry after the Holocaust, when he meant it in a more specific. Like, did you have the quote on hand, by the way?
Yeah, let me find it. Yeah, you sent the full couple of paragraphs that it's in the context of. Just a sec.
Sure.
Yeah, the more total society becomes, the greater the reification of the mind, and the more paradoxical its effort to escape reification on its own. Even the most extreme consciousness of doom threatens to degenerate into idle chatter. Cultural criticism finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. Absolute reification, which presupposed intellectual progress as one of its elements, is now preparing to absorb the mind entirely. Critical intelligence cannot be equal to this challenge as long as it confines itself to self-satisfied contemplation. And there's a second one that sort of, where he clarifies it, that you sent me, where he says, perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems. But it is not wrong to raise the less cultural question whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who escaped by accident, one who by rights should have been killed, may go on living. His mere survival calls for the coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity, without which there could have been no Auschwitz. This is the drastic guilt of him who was spared. By way of atonement he will be plagued by dreams such as that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944 and his whole existence since has been imaginary, an emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier.
And I really liked what you brought up before, that idea of the shared trauma and its kind of fragmentation throughout things like mediation and class interests. Just because, in a way, I feel like one of the big problems of like some of the really if not problematic, just kind of banal COVID poems, that they kind of like sum it up almost in a kind of like throwaway manner that that at best is like does nothing, and at worst like completely overlooks like very pertinent kind of emotions and affects that are that have come up not just in the pandemic, but just as like through like modern like Denpa-esque society as a whole, which some people might argue that the pandemic was kind of like an accelerated version of this like splintering of the individual from like society, or rather like fragmentation of society TM.
Yeah. Is that part of what Berardi's arguing, or is that like?
Yeah, I mean that
in
was
some sense
that was
it's like the
dream of
opposite.
Pandemic
Yeah.
as well. I mean, I'll also talk about mine and One Dime's favorite writer. If One Dime, if you're watching it, what's up? Byung-Chul Han's Violence of Positivity, because talking about the instrumentality of poetry, like the idea of like why now did people decide to COVID poems, right? Like, or have like the Toronto Star have A.F. Moritz write a COVID poem. Like, what was the service that poetry was supposed to render?
There was a ton of discourse about this at the beginning, and I remember seeing annoying fucking tweets in like spring 2020 that would be like, I don't want to read any poems about COVID. This isn't about poetry. It doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything. And it's always extremely selective when people say this, because on one hand, people are going to say this, and then they are going to spend the next, like, week of lockdown binging, like, Marvel TV shows. Like, you clearly are not, like, there's this weird, like, double consciousness in contemporary positivist ideology between, like, art is entirely meaningless because it is not instrumentally effective at anything, and also art, but as consumption, is the only thing that gives life any meaning or purpose, as entertainment, which is just this strange, like, bowl shuffling act where, like, art is not permitted any autonomy until it is mass producible and subject to the logic of capital, and then suddenly it's like completely outside of instrumentality and circulation, when actually it's completely inside. But yeah, no, there was a poem in the book that actually touched on this. There was the Jane Hirschfield, Today When I Could Do Nothing, that has the line, actually, I am not an essential service. And it's a poem, it's again one of these middle-class lockdown experience poems where they're like the big sort of epiphany is, today when I could do nothing, I saved an ant. The first day when I could do nothing, contribute nothing beyond staying distant from my own kind, I did this. And, like, what they're doing is, outside of that, is, like, I have coffee and books, time, a garden, silence enough to fill cisterns, and, like, this sort of, there's this weird reduction of the middle class to bare life, in a sense, where, like, suddenly we, and like, we as this sort of, like, we are living this sort of realization of, like, it's like I'm a nature poem. Like, I am this thing existing outside of production and exchange and instrumentality, and I am, like, not just art is this, but I am this, but I am, but it's like, it's simultaneously, like, utopian and terrifying. It's like, I could also be just cut out of the economy entirely. I might as well just die. Like, but instead I am like this because I have this incredible privilege, and it's just this really weird, like, paradox that just hits fully in that poem.
Also, I am not an essential service. Sounds like a T-shirt, by the way. Like, I feel like that's gonna be someone's merch line at some point. Man.
It's like, yeah.
But yeah, like, sorry, go on.
No, never mind. Keep going.
Okay. So, no, yeah. So thinking about Adorno and his observations on the cultural industry, along with like thinking about the language of catastrophe, or at least like the language that the cultural industry has bred of catastrophe, it's very obvious that even either intentionally or unintentionally, it feels like the invisible hand or arm of the cultural industry, particularly what Byung-Chul Han calls like the violence of positivity, is quite like apparent. At least like, if not in the content, but more as in the act of why poetry is given like a spotlight in this time, because in a way, like amidst like misinformation, people want to make sense of the catastrophe that's around them, and in a way, like much like a lot of different mediums, poetry is kind of one of those ways, and it has its particular ways of doing so. Through its, like, some people will say, oh, it's restraint, it's nostalgia, or it's like Dr. Seussian image of just like being playful or something like that.
Yeah.
And its purpose has like is supposed to give like a positive spin, because I highly doubt even with the poems that the poem of I don't remember who wrote it anymore, like the one about surface level or rather appropriated feminism and property rights, like even those, like there's a low chance there's going to be one that literally tells you, like in Welcome to the NHK, like things are actually bad, like things are like giving like a raw kind of reality into what it's like, into the mind of someone who's like alienated from society and then further alienated with the pandemic, which actually transitions beautifully into Berardi, because I want to give a bit of a primer. So with Berardi, like the way that I was introduced to him was through his book Heroes, thanks to a dear friend from New Jersey. Love that dude. Hope you're doing all right. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I got from his work is that it kind of mirrors Byung-Chul Han's look about ideology and capitalist systems and like neoliberal optimization being assimilated into the body, and basically being gamified in a kind of more than a biopolitical sense, but in a way of like positive reinforcement. What Berardi does is that he kind of looked at something similar, but more like what happens if the individual is so inundated with not just positivity, but kind of constant drive to competition that they just pretty much just like switch off and start committing like mass homicide, for example, or committing like acts of terror or even acts of suicide, which to Berardi, one of the main points, and I think one of his stronger points among a few others, was this idea of abstraction, deterritorialization, in the sense that the body, like, and for anyone who's an artist, like this deterritorialization is much more obvious, because it's like, oh, like the labor is strictly tied with one's like life experience, mental activity, basically things that aren't material, or you could argue as abstract in a way. And Berardi talks about labor, or the laborer, the individual, is sort of now this unit of time. They are no longer like, they're not buying the labor for their body, but for their time and their abstract value that can be accumulated from it. So with that in mind, it further alienates the individual from people around them. Although that's a story for another time, because it gets into a bit more complex touch on later. But when it comes to the pandemic, what Berardi's kind of like, the thing that got him into trouble was the pandemic was a thing because the gears of capitalism supposedly have started to come to a halt, which is kind of a paradoxical image when you think of it. Berardi was talking about the abstraction of labor, the abstraction of the violence, our capitalism in this old, like 9th century, like Victorian era smog image is both one of Berardi's weaknesses in his arguments, that some of them can be a bit dated at the cost of trying to be engaging, which his work is quite engaging. I wholeheartedly despite in problems like its conclusion, among others. It's more than he thinks that he thought the pandemic was a good thing, thinking that the system could, but of course, like, given the
you're cutting out.
But make it obvious is back in.
Yeah, you're back in. You there? Technical difficulties, please stand by. Honestly, this is going to be going a lot smoother than a lot of our previous streams.
Actually, I'm back in now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I heard the thing. Okay. Yeah, basically, sum it up. Essentially, it's funny that Berardi thinks of like the system as like old 19th century factory that dominated industry back in the day. Kind of that reactive image of it, which hints to his at least like my criticism of Berardi, but also inherent of just like the early pandemic craze, like hoping that all of this, like the neoliberal system would be defeated. I mean, especially considering a lot of what he's written, which I'll have to find. But
now that you mentioned the factory thing, I just noticed something that I've never really thought about in terms of the pandemic before, but in terms of like China having such a more like thorough and rigorous response, like, and people like attribute that to China's political culture, to its authoritarian government, to its like more sort of like docile and compliant social culture, etc. But honestly, probably a big part of that, and it may have just extended to the region, is China being the world's industrial heartland, and being where you can't just have this, like, ridiculous compromise around essential labor that we have here, because the majority of the workforce is actually essential, not just for your own country, but for, like, the entire world physical economy and infrastructure. Like, they did not have the option of just, like, on one hand, they did not have the option of just, like, closing the factories there indefinitely. They also did not have the option of just leaving the factories open and letting COVID run through them rampant and, like, kill, like, a significant percentage of the workers, because both of those things would have actually ground the gears of the world economy to a halt in the way Berardi was imagining, from the, like, inessential labor of the first world being shut down. And instead of letting that happen, they actually imposed a much more, like, effective, pandemic response than we did, for the sake of the world economy. and their own economy, which hinges on it. That's my
which is interesting
theory
now,
right now.
considering
Yeah, keep going.
Which is interesting now, considering the industrial heartland of the world, China, has now been rebuking against its so-called what's it called Western paymasters, so to speak, or former paymasters, considering GDP growth into account.
Yeah.
Which actually, I'm sure Berardi could probably make an interesting hypothesis on, considering territorialization and deterritorialization. I'm sure his metaphor could also extend to countries, especially since what in here we talked about reactive territorialization, reactive kind of establishment of identity as a means as a means against abstraction. Some of his examples of certain atrocity perpetrators, Breivik, trying to fight for this Christian Europe.
Well, that was at the very beginning of the pandemic, before liberals even started paying attention to it. There was this brief right-wing pandemic fervor where people like Mencius Mold, where people were saying we need to close the borders, and people like Mencius Moldbug were even saying oh, we can just close all borders forever now and conduct all necessary business via Amazon drones, but also let countries grow in their own isolated cultural bubbles and reverse globalization, which was his own version of the sort of silly pandemic utopianism I find in Berardi when he's talking about the gears of capitalism grinding to a halt, which a year on we look back and it's just hilariously not what happened.
The system just kept going. Actually, funnily enough, reading Heroes and seeing the conclusion, it's funny that, scrolling back through it again, I see this line, because the last chapter of Heroes is, so what can we do when nothing can be done? And he basically goes into this Persona 4 monologue, as much as I like Persona 4, about you can't be exploited, you can't give up to abstraction and whatever, and there's this sentence where it's literally nothing can be done anymore, so let's do nothing. And kind of my criticism of Berardi, at least with Heroes, is that he goes into a lot of detail about how the individual's agency, political or otherwise, has been compromised by abstraction, and then he just ends it with just going oh, well, what can you do, kind of thing. And then this is just kind of a continuation of that same thing. It's nothing can be done anymore, let's do nothing, and just flips the table, kind of.
And then in response to that, as soon as something slightly happens, he flips to exaggerating the agency of a virus, and or exaggerating the collective agency that we are somehow given by this virus to. What was the exact phrase he used that we talked about that was really funny, where it's turning it off and on again?
Yes. Let me find it. Here it is. The Christ to come it's on the second one. Normality must not return, which is pretty fitting considering. The ongoing crisis is not a real crisis. It is a reset, all caps. It is a matter of turning off the machine and turning it on again after a while. Yet when we turn it back on, we can decide to make it work as before, running the risk of finding ourselves living the same nightmare all over again. Or we can decide to reprogram it according to science, consciously and sensitively. When this story will end, and in a sense it never ends because the virus will be able to recede without disappearing, and although we might invent vaccines, the virus can always adapt, we will have to face a period of extraordinary depression. If we simply pretend to return to normal, we might have to face violence, totalitarianism, massacres, and the extinction of human race before the end of the century. Normality must not return. Yeah. Oh well, I mean, there's a couple others that follow it actually. I'll read the whole thing actually. This is because this is near the end. We won't have to ask ourselves what is good for the stock market or for the economy of debt and profit. Finance has gone to hell. We don't want to hear about it anymore. We will have to ask ourselves what is really useful. The word useful must be the alpha and omega of production, technology, and activity. I realize that I'm saying things bigger than myself, but we must prepare ourselves to face huge choices. When the story ends, if you want to be ready, you need to start thinking about what's useful and how you can produce it without destroying the environment and the human body. We will also have to think about the most delicate question of all. Besides, pay attention. When the who decides arises, it brings along the question, what is the source of legitimacy? This is a question to begin the revolution with, whether we want it or not. This is a question we ought to ask ourselves. So, blue pill or red pill?
And now, like, the extreme irony of this passage is that, like, if people have been paying attention to the red-pilled people these days, thing everyone's freaked out about is the Great Reset, which is the exact language here, and it's from this World Economic Forum plan to reset the global economy in response to the pandemic as something radically more sustainable and equitable, but in ways that are like amenable to the World Economic Forum's vision of this. So it basically means just digitizing more stuff and like investing in green tech through capitalist means. And of course, other scarier stuff potentially, depending on who you read and what interpretations of it. But I find it very funny that, like, this, the first Great Reset stuff came out in, May 2020, I think. Like, Prince Charles was first talking about it, and, like, Prince Charles and Klaus Schwab started talking about it in, like, May 2020, which is a couple of months after Berardi wrote this. And my, like, headcanon now is that they read this. Like, somebody at the World Economic Forum was reading, like, the Berardi Pandemic Diaries and was like, yeah, that's what we want to do. Like, we're totally talking about the same thing here, which, given Berardi's sort of, like, hyper-anxiety about co-optation of anything that can be perceived to be within the system, such that he imagines the only option is, like, turning the system off and on again in this one, like, instantaneous, completely abstract way. And in, like, walling himself into that, he creates an image and a metaphor that's actually so, like, apophatic and unthinkable that it can be used by the literal World Economic Forum as a slogan for whatever the fuck they're doing.
I think it's also interesting, too, that I think Berardi, Berardi's thinking of turning the system on and off again isn't like a rare, we can talk like about whether they read Berardi or not, but I think that notion of turning the system on and off, just think of it in that kind of mechanical way, is indicative more of just, like, perhaps people's thoughts about how to negotiate the system or how to negotiate political action. Just because, as we've seen, like, recently, it seems that Berardi's also that political action in office has failed. Like, essentially, half of this is him saying how, like, old politics is over.
And
it's
that
just
part's
reinforcing the
certainly
point,
being borne
as he
out.
called. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
And that part's certainly being borne out by the past year. Keep going.
Yeah, that's true. And even for things like protests, like the effectiveness of protests and demonstrations, while necessary, it's quite evident that their transformative power supposedly is starting to fade, or at least it's starting to get co-opted. I mean, like, we've seen countless examples from like the Arab Spring to the Hong Kong protests, and how it becomes like a battle of ideology among like others instead of like, you know, tackling pressing onward against salient problems.
Yeah.
And so, and I remember one of my buddies, I was talking to them, and they talked about how the most effective political action, or at least one of the most effective bits of political action now, is like mutual aid, in the way of like being able to help like people around you. It's much more effective than, say, like going out and like reigning in the chaos of broke Target or whatever.
Yeah.
But even so, like thinking that the overall system, which, you know, unlike Berardi's prediction, is still going, just in or at least a lot less contact based. It's still going. Really just goes more to show, like, yes, Berardi's point is astute. Yes, the way that we're approaching politics and action related to politics, and even for poetry, the way that we're thinking of poetry for a catastrophe, like that stuff is over. And if we want to think of them as being like signals for change, in a sense, but just that the facile conclusion of, oh, let's just, you know, caveman shit, let's turn the thing off and on again. Like, that does nothing. I mean, I appreciate the sentiment where he's coming from, especially considering the immense duress that he's in, given Italy's thing. But it's actually quite similar more to Yukio Mishima's observation of Sun and Steel, where he was reading the letters of kamikaze pilots, and he said that they were moving in an affective way, considering the context, but a lot of them are filled with a kind of sentimental, emotional cliche in a way. And I suppose, like, what Mishima found there could be perhaps like one of the things that people think of, well, rather the cultural industry product of poetry that they put out in a sense, like, or at least one way of summing that up.
Which is interesting, because we've now reached we've now moved between the two poles of sentimental cliche in COVID literature, and I do think the Berardi Diaries fall more into sort of literature than theory. They are in the sort of diaristic and aphoristic literary tradition that's often been a sort of response to plague conditions. But, like, he literally positions himself against the let me find the line again. Against the together in a sudden strangeness mode of COVID poetics, explicitly in this one line where he's like, but for now, enough with women and human tragedies. Enough is enough. He's talking about what he's reading. And then he's like, so I went and got a relaxing book, The Orlando Furioso, read by Italo Calvino. And, like, we've sort of gotten, I guess, like, the sort of young boy and young girl responses to COVID I guess, between these two kind of texts.
Yeah, actually, do you want to go into a little bit more detail about that? I was meaning to go into Theory of the Young Girl, but I didn't. But,
yeah! I mean, you can start out talking about Young Girl from what you've been reading of it, and then I can explain my Young Boy riff on it, just to preview what we're going to be publishing, hopefully, in either the end of this year or early next year. Preliminary notes to a Theory of the Young Boy, a response to Tikkun's preliminary notes to a Theory of the Young Girl, which...
Well, I mean, I feel like Theory of the Young Girl is one of those texts you got to read like a few times to get like a solid grasp on it, because there's so much going on it, especially because with it, like, you're kind of in the thick of like a lot of loaded advertising statements that perfectly encapsulate the Young Girl to the theory. But thinking of it right now, I think the one line that I can think of is the one where they talk about the young girl being as a point of view that is alive, and I think like that's quite cogent, talking about like affective industries, like the affective post-cultural industries, kind of like euphoric product. Like, you talked about the epiphany, right, in certain poems, and that's kind of been co-opted into the ways that people sell poetry. I mean, or at least like define poetry as a kind of like sellable commodity. As Theory of the Young Girl is essentially taking this metaphorical idea of the young girl and how it's kind of it kind of becomes like how that particular like neoliberal system assimilates itself into the body of this metaphorical young girl, and it's like and their thinking and attitudes kind of thing. I mean, I mean that's kind of like a quick and dirty way of summarizing. It's a lot more complex.
I mean, you use the term affect economy a lot, and we always make like riffs and jokes on this, but essentially what both the young girl and the young boy are is like sort of paradigmatic subjects of the affect economy, in the sense that like the bourgeois subject or the worker or the Protestant like capitalist was a paradigmatic, or the Homo economicus was a paradigmatic subject of the like physical economy of early capitalism. These are both sort of like subjects whose affective life has been economized and mediated in particular ways, and the first model for this is sort of built on the gendered roles of young women throughout like the sort of previous gender role, and towards this like a certain form of bourgeois domesticity, a certain form of like at the same time individualism that's towards like a kind of materialistic happiness and also like a dematerialized intimacy. And the young boy is like this sort of tweak on the same principle that's emerged both from the critique and the response to it in sort of like naive anti-consumerism, and from the concrete transformation of consumption with the internet into consumption and production of data, and that allows it to somewhat unmoor itself from certain stereotypes and affects of what the consumer subject is, from certain associations of the consumer subject and the body in its pursuit of its both satisfaction and self-idealization, and to integrate all these sort of like seemingly philosophical and idealistic motives, like the sort of rebellious Logo Daedalus thing, into the affect economy, which he's still participating in through, like, Twitter. Yeah. We'll talk more about this, because it's a concept I use for talking about virtually anything, and again, the book is coming out, so...
For sure. Actually, the thing that just occurred to me, I think, that's quite prescient for Theory of the Young Girl is the idea of, like, exchangeability, like the symbol of exchangeability being of the young girl. I guess just as a bit of a preview for Theory of the Young Boy, like, where does exchangeability factor in for like the young boy, especially since the young boy is a lot more of like a wired kind of subject, or at least like a subject that's more inclined to the use of the internet. There's always like an exchange of symbols and images like almost all the time. I mean, especially since, like, connecting from one place to another, so to speak.
But it's also a much more sort of like obscured form of exchange where, like, there's not as much of a sort of like medium, like the sort of value form in the same sense, and it all does get translated into the value form, but at the same time you get things like, I mean, I think here's a great symbol of the young boy is the non-fungible token that came out just this past year, and suddenly every sort of like rebellious gave people this way of being like rebellious internet artists breaking out from like art TM in the sense we meant poetry TM, at the same time as getting super rich and becoming like new capitalists. And this is predicated on this specific digital form that allows you to make a non-exchangeable object that can reassert this artistic aura that can like exist in a single form, not equivalent to anything, perfectly individual and unique, but also that in this uniqueness is assigned like an immediate number value that is constantly fluctuating in an incredibly complex digital mathematical game that people play that people play like a video game in this like sort of stock market meme crypto market, and in this, and they're still reifying the value of this object, but it's reified in a completely different way. It's reified through its uniqueness and through this gamification rather than through the sort of mundane exchangeability of like the MCM circuit of like the value form in its previous form, which is potentially in the Great Reset getting phased out for a cashless economy and like state-backed cryptos anyway.
Or the fear that, people will be like, oh my god, it's like there'll be no more like private ownership, you will own nothing in the Great Reset.
Yeah. Which is all related, but that's a whole other kind of story.
Before we get into Samuel Delaney's Tale of Plagues and Carnivals, actually, just reviewing from what we've seen so far, I actually want to know, what do you think are the, like, I guess just for the meme, right? Like, what are the kind of like pandemic, I guess COVID-19 cliches that tend to like crop up as motifs?
Oh, here's one I wanted to get to in my second rant that I completely forgot to mention as like an example of the thing where like nobody is witnessing the pandemic directly. Like, almost nobody in this book knows anyone who died from COVID. There's a whole bunch of poems where they like invoke someone who died unrelatedly before the pandemic and talk about that as just sort of like an invocation of the general concept of death, as opposed to like the specificity of death from a particular disease in a global pandemic, and I found that kind of funny. One of my favorite ones was actually an instance of this, and I'm not sure if it's, like, better than the others, or if it was just the first one I noticed before I noticed everyone was doing this. But, like, there's a ton of, like, dead mother poems, and it's, like, it's never someone who died from COVID. It's someone who died, like, a while ago. That's an interesting one. I sort of talked about the general, like, format of just sort of, like, an observation on some kind of natural phenomenon leading to an epiphany, or, like, what else? That's, like, the most pronounced micro-genre in here. There was another one, but I'm forgetting.
You mean that's
there
not
were
just
a number
like,
that were just straight
it's just like, oh,
pastoral
getting
poems
involved
that
by
didn't even
physical
pretend
access.
to have anything to do with the pandemic.
What?
There were a number that were just straight pastoral poems that didn't even pretend to have anything to do with the pandemic. But, like, yeah.
Pandemic? Look at these flowers, man.
Yeah. The other micro-genre, there were a lot of ones called prayers, and it's always very ambiguous whether the people in question, like, the people writing this even really believe in God, or, like, what they mean. I don't think you have to, like, believe in God in, like, an American Christian fundamentalist sense to pray. I really like the Wittgenstein sense of prayer that I believe is referenced in Subahibi, where, like, to pray is to think about the meaning of the world. There's, like, at the same time, I liked that one I read, at the end there, as one of the few that feels like it really takes prayer seriously.
Right. Actually, now that you mentioned prayer, I want to bring this up actually in relation to Holocaust poetry, or at least like poems talking about the atrocities of the Holocaust. I remember Paul Celan was a writer who was mostly celebrated for kind of like minimalist form, which I remember reading some of it, and yeah, some of it's pretty good. I will say that, well, given that in the, I don't know if it was like a 2000s or the early 2010s where there was like an obsession with like minimalism to display trauma, but I think that, or at least I get the feeling that there's just been a huge sliding scale to the other side where it's just like instead of being restrained with language in order to get at a unappendable sublime, it's now more of like language is limited and it can't and it cannot articulate. Which, you know, if you're in the field, like that's just kind of like a huge cop out and just like a huge disgrace to the medium. I mean, there's a reason why I keep saying that every time when we're talking about the American COVID poems, I'll be like, man, if Marty Severia or anyone who's really into the poetic craft, like, read this, they'll fucking flip out. Like, they'll I joked like Mark might write like a credo de volta too, like if he saw him.
Well, but, yeah, Paul Celan, he's like a guy. I haven't read enough of him, but I know of him as someone who is frequently invoked as someone whose poetry was sort of an answer to the can poetry be written after Auschwitz question, as someone who was, like, directly a Holocaust survivor. And for him, like, yes, it can, but it does not resemble anything that poetry was before. It does not resemble the sort of, like, conventional, like, stable, meaning-based use of language. And in that, it's a minimalism completely different from the minimalism that was trendy for a while recently in, like, alt-lit and stuff.
Right.
And about the Auschwitz thing, too, like, I do think it's interesting to sort of, like, because I always interpreted that quote as really not applying to something like COVID. Pandemics, epidemics have happened throughout history. Disease has been like a nearly constant human historical factor. People have been writing literature about it since fucking what's the guy? Is it I'm forgetting that Renaissance thing. That's like a bunch of people holed up, basically in quarantine in a castle, telling each other the Italian Canterbury tales. Yes, it was Boccaccio, it was the Decameron. People have been writing about it since that, since probably the fucking Bible. There's, whereas Auschwitz is something historically new, and there cannot be poetry after Auschwitz is one of the paradigmatic invocations of the Holocaust as something historically new, as a distinct kind of, suffering and evil that's only possible with modernity. And there are, objections to its sort of exceptionalism in that people can say that, and I think there's a very good case to be made that, say, the genocide of indigenous Americans or the Middle Passage is a similarly, exceptional event. But it's still, that is this part of the sense in which I always understood that to be meant, that it breaks the sort of historical pact between suffering and poetry, in a sense, by, but when I read Adorno on that, and I read it in his specific context, I see sort of what he means more. In partly what he means is exceptional about it is that it is this modern form of, of cruelty that's subject to these modern logics of instrumentalization and reification, which the rest of society, the rest of sort of life is hence complicit in. And COVID, as a distinctly modern pandemic, as I was arguing, is the same, in a sense, there, even insofar as, rather than being uniquely horrible because of its modernization, like Auschwitz was, even insofar as it has been, in some ways, uniquely, kind of mild and livable because of its modernization, which puts us in, as people living through COVID, kind of in that position he describes of the survivor, whose mere survival calls for the coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity, without which there could have been no Auschwitz, which is what I was saying about sort of the morality of solipsism and all of that. The drastic guilt of him who was spared, which is what the guilt I'm trying to escape in that nature poem.
Right. That's kind of cool you bring that up too, just because it gets me to think of when people talk about. I remember showing it to you, the phosphorus scene in Spec Ops: The Line, where when people talk about what made it so horrifying, not just for the content, considering the destructive power of white phosphorus, at least in the game, just because people disputed how much can burn people in real life compared to in game, but they're both equally horrible. But just that, for some people, more of the horror came from the casual nature of dispensing violence, and talking about COVID and the Holocaust in their kind of dimensions of atrocity kind of mirrored that in a sense, because with the white phosphorus, I'm sure you're aware, as soon as it gets into contact with it's toxic in the air, for one thing, and it immediately burns whatever it comes into contact with. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some some footage of people in the Middle East who've been burned by white phosphorus, and they'll never recover again.
Yeah.
Like in the same way of when you look in a similar way when you look at say burial grounds of entire bodies in when they searched through the camps after the fact.
Yeah.
And then with COVID, you don't have the upfront atrocity. In fact, by that point, upfront atrocity is kind of like the words cruel, destructive, and horrifying kind of feel banal, especially since in a state of total war that plagued the 2000s with the Iraq War, with trade wars, Cold Wars, but now it's just an exacerbation of the more invisible kind of violence inflicted upon the individual, psychologically, as well as the casual cruelty dispensed by others that for some wouldn't even think of before, but is apparent.
I mean, we do have escalating Cold War with China as a big part of COVID politics, but anyway, we're past the 2-hour mark, so we should probably just at least touch on what did you think of a paradigm, a sort of piece of pandemic literature from before COVID as a point of comparison, but still a piece of modern pandemic literature. I can't remember if I said I thought of COVID as the first modern pandemic, but it's really not the first modern pandemic. The first modern pandemic was AIDS. Again, I'm using this, obviously there have been pandemics within various sort of historical categories of modernity. There was the 1918 flu, there was, that one weird thing in the 50s, was it the Hong Kong flu or something? There was something from Asia that killed as many people as COVID and you've never heard of because they didn't do anything about it.
What? It's SARS, right?
No, I'm not talking about SARS. I'm talking about something from the 50s. It's referenced in a Pogue song.
What?
Yeah. SARS didn't even kill that many people. SARS was a sort of one of the many pandemic false alarms that sort of, or pandemics that were stopped before they got bad.
Right.
But let me search Hong Kong flu. I think that's what it was called. Yeah, 1968 flu pandemic. Outbreak between 1968 and 1969 killed between 1 and 4 million people globally. It's among the deadliest pandemics in history, and you have never heard of it because, again, it was impossible to shut down the economy in the sense that we've done now, and it was also, just too fast to really respond to in any other way, the way we, cooked up a vaccine overnight for this. So really, things like that don't feel like modern pandemics in the sense that they were not managed in this modern biopolitical, technological way. 1918 pretended wasn't happening because the war was going on at the same time. This people just pretended wasn't people talked about it, but there wasn't much they could do about it. It was just one of those medieval plagues that sweeps through and wipes out X% of people. AIDS was something that would have been that, except that the gay community actually forced it through intense and hard-fought activism into being something that the government responds to, concertedly with a broad technological, social, and, technological, social, and political effort on all fronts. And, that there was middling levels of success in this that a lot of it didn't really happen until it started affecting straight people, and then the government was like, oh, I guess we shouldn't have been ignoring this for all these years. I wish I had a much... Like, I'm giving really broad strokes. I don't know this history that well. Like... And so Delaney's Tale of Plagues and Carnivals is this interesting because it's deliberately a contrast between the structure of the text is it's one of his Nevarian... It's a novella in his Nevarian series, which is a series of, like, sword and sorcery fantasy novellas set in a, like, prehistoric / Bronze Age, like really early civilization, in, like, what's explicitly a literary construction of that, not meant to be, like, a sort of realistic image of it, but at the same time is far more realistic than your average sword and sorcery novel, and goes into way more, like, economic and social detail, and it's a story about a plague happening in this ancient pre-modern city of Kolhari or Neveriona, that's a sexually transmitted plague, much like AIDS, and it alternates this with just his observations of life in New York during the early AIDS outbreak, talking and interacting with gay people, homeless people, drug users. Like, he basically knew, like, every slice of society that was affected by it in the early period. And he knew, like, the part of the gay community that was, like, engaged in stuff like public sex, cruising, stuff that was, like, extremely exposed to AIDS through sort of casual encounters with strangers. You there?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, I'm still here.
So yeah, what did you think of... I know you didn't finish, but what did you think of what you've read of it so far? Because it's sort of contrasting... What I was just saying is it's basically contrasting this pre-modern plague with this plague that is not yet modern because the government isn't responding to it, and they are sort of, like, trapped in this, like, in a sense, within this modern city, in this sort of, like, historical, like, fugue state where they're living like sort of peasants in a, like, medieval or, like, ancient city because they're being neglected by the government and health authorities and modern and capital. Yeah, what do you think of how he handles that? And
I will say that it actually surprised me in the sense that so unlike a lot of the COVID poems that we covered, where they either approach the pandemic with, like, directly in its content, or just, like, make mild reference, or like avoid it altogether. The one thing that they all had in common was that it was all based on, like, the language they were using. But with Plague of Tales and Carnivals, it takes more of an experimental structure, which at first, to me, like, I'm not that used to, like, experimental, like, structures in terms of literature. Like, I kind of like gravitated away from it just because I think, oh, it could be like it can be kind of gimmicky, but in here it doesn't feel gimmicky. In fact, it actually feels somewhat effective. It's interesting you mentioned this fugue state, because I actually wanted to say that it feels a lot like a Denpa text, in the sense that like you remember in the end of Evangelion where essentially the whole, like, bit of like Shinji and LCL kind of cuts to real life footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, and this fragmentary nature of narrative and real life commentary, despite it seeming so simple, like really captures more of the kind of dire of not just a dire situation of like being in a pandemic, while at the same time being like distant from it in some way. But it also began to talk a little bit about like pandemic or even catastrophe as a myth or as a fiction, not a myth of fiction as in that it's false, but more like it's it becomes like it's a non-concrete entity in the same way that language is a non-concrete entity, which was kind of why I thought about the of like imperial colonialism the world over. So because he thought that the only way to combat it was to like wipe it out entirely, and here like Delaney talks a little bit about the transmission of language, what's it in 2.2? He says diseases should not become social metaphors. Sontag informed us in illness is metaphor. I've already seen her analysis of cancer as a social model quoted in the discussion of AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. These are a host of misconceptions indeed often determine the metaphors themselves in a system of reciprocal stabilization, possible both psychologically and socially, both in terms of how you feel and how others, with their feelings, treat you to have the disease in a healthy manner. So touching on that subject and having that be one of the running threads certainly makes this a lot more interesting because it literally appends the question, right? Like how do we even begin to talk about catastrophe, about a pandemic, about AIDS or COVID or the Holocaust or the atomic bomb, or like in a way that would seem fitting, and it sort of does so with this kind of fragmentary journey. And part of the reason why I talk about it being a Denpa text is that it's this kind of leaning between like an invisible kind of reality upon a I guess fictional world in some way, shape, or form. Kind of in the same way that perhaps there's like the kind of time loops in Higurashi, or even the kind of way that I'm trying to think of a good example for Subihibi, but just the kind of like the palpable kind of psychological violence that's in it, particularly because you spend a lot of time with characters, well, particularly with like Zakuro or Takuji, where you kind of live their lives essentially in the same way that a drone operator is very familiar with their targets before executing them.
Yeah.
And and it kind of bridges into the real a little bit.
Yeah, there's a sort of like hyper reality in that, where like there's not in a Ceylon-esque sort of way. There's like not a lot of the sort of conventional structuring elements of like narrative symbolic reality, but there's also just like intense amounts of like social and physical and sort of incidental detail in all of these different fragments that's like a level of reality you normally wouldn't even let into a more controlled narrative, and that a more controlled narrative would like suppress or sort of like background in a way, and that it's it gets very meta about this, about sort of like this necessary fragmentation of experience and memory and how, okay. Should we just do Discord? Okay. Yeah, sorry. You're really gonna like where it goes in the latter half. You're really gonna like where it goes in the latter half. It's a shame we couldn't talk about that. I guess you can add some tweets or something afterwards. You said you compared it. You said there was something that reminded you of. You're connecting all these other things we talk about all the time, but you said there was a bit that reminded you of like Metal Gear Solid. What was that?
Oh, just literally talking about language as transmission, like in the in point two, talking about these generate such metaphors, talking about literally the language of the way that we talk about disease, about catastrophe, and how in Metal Gear Solid 5, the villain Skullface, how he wanted to eradicate the English language with the with like a virus that pretty much affects anyone who even knows English. So that connection came about. Not just for the incidental way that it's like they're kind of similar, like talking about language as a disease, but or at least having like a viral kind of function, but also because supposedly the reason that Skullface wanted that virus was because he thought that the English language was symbolic and indicative of the colonial violence that inflicted other countries and still continues to inflict other countries. Or to put it in simplest terms, he was afraid that every other country would become just like America in a sense because of the English language. Hence why he wanted to destroy it. And in a way, thinking about language as a way to append like not just catastrophe, but also of like modernity itself, in a sense. I thought that question was kind of interesting, and the way that Delaney brings it up here, like as threads to talk about AIDS in a way that in a way that's like that's actually cognizant of the of its reality is very similar to the way that like what we were talking about. Like one of the main threads of this podcast was how do we begin to talk about catastrophe from the pandemic to the others. So that was what came to mind for me in terms of like language as a particular force. And I guess like in a way, like it kind of it goes against a lot of I guess the kind of cynicism behind language, just because as we were talking about, right? Like some of the other COVID poems are easy just to dismiss like the power of language. Just go, oh, I just stayed inside and I'm just gonna be like not nice to people. I'm just gonna be rude. I'm just gonna be mean.
Yeah, that one was an outlier. Most of them are just like, I'm just gonna stay inside and like appreciate my wife and Zoom call my kids and like look at flowers and listen to Bach. Like, but yeah. But yeah, that Sontag quote, like that, I'm surprised we didn't bring that up earlier, because like that is like up there with the No Poetry After Auschwitz in terms of just like really famous aphorisms that are immediately and obviously relevant to writing about COVID. And like, yeah, what do you think about like how, I mean, I guess like the sort of it's not so much the disease has become a metaphor as like lockdown and quarantine have become a metaphor for this, again, certain kind of, like, bourgeois propertied pastoral image of life and image of the meaning of life, and a particular contradiction in that. The like sense in which it obviously applies in AIDS and that Delaney's sort of reckoning with in that text is obviously the fact that, like, it is a sexually transmitted illness. It's defined by a certain forms of intimacy that were deemed sinful and unnatural by a whole, like, complex of, and also dirty and disgusting and sort of unclean by centuries, millennia of, like, cultural construction. And right at the moment that they're starting to become more accepted, you have this horrible catastrophe of, like, a disease spread by the exact thing you're trying to destigmatize, and it is primarily affecting you. It is not affecting, like, it does eventually spread to straight people, but, like, it's not, like, primarily, the victims of it aren't primarily straight mainstream society, and as soon as they were, that logic of it being sort of a punishment for sin goes away, and it is treated as a sort of, like, physical thing to be managed scientifically, and almost immediately becomes much easier to deal with as such. But while it is primarily affecting these people, it also seems like a sign of this sort of, like, uncleanness and tabooness of themselves and their practices, even as it's hurting them, and even as they are demanding it be recognized. And again, that's where, like, that whole sort of, like, paradox, again, of the Molly Klein quote I was thinking about earlier, like, like, if AIDS was today, would we have banned sex thing, like, because COVID also is, like, the inversion of this lockdown as metaphor for, like, the sort of satisfied individual, in returning to nature and property as the meaning of life, is the image of sort of collectivity and the urban and intimacy is what spreads this disease, which is in a much broader sense than it was with AIDS, but, like, the shadow of that metaphor is still there. At the same time, like, and there's an interesting contrast in that, like, we sort of did, like, what Molly Klein is alluding to is that, like, we just immediately moved, like, because that was a mainstream form of that was not previously gathered under a model and metaphor of illness as uncleanness as sin, it was immediately responded to by the whole of society, or by, like, the authorities of society, making these sweeping judgments across society as a whole, deeming certain persons and activities as essential or inessential, creating these divides that weren't there before in the social metaphor of this illness that was supposedly a pandemic that affects everyone and brings everyone together. And, like, which is very much the opposite of what happened with AIDS, where, like, this pre-existing social script for an illness sort of leads to society not doing anything about it, and in response, gay people struggle to present it as like a universal and scientific problem. And in doing so, you get the discrepancy that Molly Klein alluded to, where the gay people did not, and there was a whole conflict that within the gay community that, again, I was just reading about in, like, the, just before we went on here, and I still don't understand really well about, like, the extent to which they should, like, close the bathhouses and shit like that. And, like, basically everything we understand as modern safe sex common sense, wear a condom, like, the sort of, like, going to the sexual health clinic, getting checked out, all this stuff that's now in, like, sex ed classes for normal high schoolers was basically developed by the gay community in response to AIDS. Like, and, like, they did this instead of, like, complete sexual lockdown, because in their position, like, where their intimacy is what makes them vulnerable to the disease and also to the social metaphor of the disease, they can't, like, they can't sort of compromise, like, make this simple one-to-one exchange of one for the other that we did, and they also aren't forced to by, society as a whole intervening and deciding how, different aspects of the disease and the response are prioritized. So you actually had, like, both intense internal debate within the gay community about what kinds of sexual practices should be adopted and abolished and regulated within the community, what kinds of forms of intimacy are and aren't safe, and also with the, like, society as a whole, where they were setting the agenda, or trying to set the agenda, lobbying the government to respond to this. And we really didn't have many moments like that in COVID where the agenda was set from the bottom up. There was, like, attempts to do things like the rent strike. I don't know what the hell ever happened to that. Like, but because the...
Excuse me, are you on or you just
I'm
talking?
on. Because the, like, response, because it threatened capitalism and threatened this reset as Berardi was talking about, was so instantaneous, we never really got the opportunity to, like, negotiate safer forms of intimacy, and in doing so, negotiate a sort of metaphor of illness that doesn't fall into this, or negotiate a theory of illness that doesn't fall into this metaphor that produces the paradoxes of COVID poetics that we've been discussing for the past 3 hours. And I think that's part of why a text like Tale of Plagues and Carnivals is possible. And it's a different kind of, like, yeah, different kind of pandemic modernism than... Just to close...
Actually, what's also...
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah?
No, just keep going.
Oh, well, I actually find kind of interesting, too, is that, let's see, what year did this take place? I mean, I know it took place...
Shit, let me go check. When was it written?
But it did take place before the 2000s, right?
Oh yeah, way before the 2000s. This was in the 80s.
Okay. Right, gotcha. Yeah, no, because actually, one thing that occurred to me was I just remembered when in one of like Spencer's essays about Ubisoft, he was talking about how like I think what was it Rainbow Six Siege or something it's like tackles an interesting kind of terrorism called stochastic terrorism, where it's not even about the direct act of violence itself upon nations, but more of like the dread that overhangs like the nation that was attacked, and hence breeding like sort of violent reactive sentiment. Surprisingly, Delaney's work really captures that. Albeit there's a lot less like violent reaction and just more of like you feel the constant like presence of AIDS, even if it's not like directly affecting like the affecting the story. And I think that that kind of like that kind of invisibility really is like a potent ray of fire of not just like illness as a whole, but also of like abstraction. Like in a sense, it's like the idea in Serial Experiments Lane where it's like you don't even need the real world anymore in a sense.
Yeah. But it's very yeah. Do you have much more to you wanted to say about it? Because
let's see. Well, the only thing I was going to mention was that I remember we were having this discussion before about how syphilis and COVID were similar.
Oh yeah. I was comparing syphilis more to AIDS as like a previous sort of like sexually transmitted pandemic. But yeah, that's like one of the that's like the great early modern pandemic, and it was spread partly by the colonization of the Americas. I don't know enough about that history. I don't think there's that much we can go into about it.
Just because I was talking about like some people, much like some people could probably see Berardi included, right? Like COVID being being kind of the fallout of the over-competition, the over-competitive, hyper-connected, individual economic body, and then the acceleration of that turns out to be like a completely empty where everyone is isolated. Of course, that didn't last too long because we had the internet, and then syphilis was mostly associated with trade ports. Basically the kind of lifeline of the countries that inflicted the most colonial violence in a sense, right?
Yeah.
But also as well, now that you mention it too, because I just remembered this back when I was attending readings years ago. I remember there was someone talking about the kind of at least in the 2010s how can I word this marketable queerness. I remember someone bringing that up in 2014s, and I was just wondering about how that might affect pandemic protocols now, especially
about Delaney very much talks about one of Delaney's obsessions kind of is how that sort of marketable queerness is itself a response to the AIDS pandemic and to ultimately sort of the compromise of gay sexual culture and the sort of move towards assimilation into sort of straight sexual culture after the AIDS pandemic and the sort of destruction of these specifically gay spaces like the cruising and the bathhouses, and much of which was imposed from the outside because eventually countered with sort of almost overly optimistic reading I was giving there. Like, the state did step in to regulate. Again, I don't know much of this history, but, like, the, like, and how, like, so he'll write stuff like, what was it? Like, his sort of vision of queerness is very opposite to that, and he's ended up writing these, like, nowadays he mostly writes, like, these 600-page porn books that are, like, sort of, that one of which, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, extremely interesting book that, in terms of, like, content warnings is on about the same level as Damien Ark's Fucked Up, is, like, like, that book explicitly is, like, as I described it in a Tumblr post once, it's about, like, a the wrong generation gay who's, like, everyone just wants to, like, get married and live in a suburban house with, like, nice curtains now. This is completely alienating to me. I want to suck off homeless guys under a bridge. Yeah.
Yo, it sounds like either a queer, like, life without principle or a queer, like, Trivisa.
I'm not sure. I don't know Trivisa, but it's definitely not like Life Without Principle because they're not participating. Like, they also kind of, like, drop out of capitalism as much as possible. I mean, he goes and lives on, like, a boat with some garbage men and, like, basically lives pretty isolated from the world. And to the point that, like, the book extends, like, 60 or 70 years in the future, and you only get sort of, like, glimpses of what's going on economically and politically outside. And most of what you see in terms of future is just, like, technological changes that would affect the working class. Like, at some point you get these, like, semi-automated things for, like, construction of houses where it becomes, like, much less skilled labor and sort of anyone can do it who can operate this tech. And yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, actually, that notion about being in the wrong generation, being, like, out of time, because I also read Young at the time, but I won't go into it, is, like, it's kind of interesting. Like, well, to allude to, let's say, Life Without Principle, for example, like the guy Panther played by Sean Loudmouth, like, his character is almost always, like, out of place, like, in a way. Like, when that guy's explaining to him how stocks work, he just goes like, "God, it's just like Baccarat," and he just, like, immediately makes like that comparison, and like the other stockbrokers are, just think of it however you want.
Yeah, I guess it is sort of similar to that. There's, like, one scene at the end where one of the characters just has, like, a mental breakdown because he doesn't know how to use a credit card. And, again, the economy is basically transitioned to cashless at that point, and up to then he'd never needed to learn.
Bro, that sounds like a scene out of a Johnny Toe.
It's a really good book. You should read Dahlgren first, but at some point you should probably read it. Anyway, I think we can just about wrap it up with one. I just wanted to sort of, like, bring it back to the contemporary and back to COVID a bit with as sort of a vision of an alternative contemporary COVID poetics. I was talking to Mika, and she told me that actually, like, all her stuff kind of deals with catastrophe in some sense, and all of it is, like, certainly very, like, poetry after Auschwitz, but it's specifically Semtex ads in the back of shonen magazines, is one she thought of as a response to COVID, like, that she experienced as that, which I just wanted to touch on, because it's a very like, it's also about the main sense in which, and there's a reference to, like, an actual pandemic somewhere in it. I think, like, the line, where is it? There's something like, where was it? Oh yeah, chemtrails are more sinister than you realize. Americans should have been wearing M17 gas masks years ago. 300K dead and counting, lol. Like, that's the most explicitly sort of pandemic imagery in it, and it's like an image of modernity directly as the pandemic, inflected through the sort of tongue-in-cheek conspiracy imagery. But, like, it's also extremely about isolation, and particularly, again on the sexual metaphor, it's like this sort of femcel one. It's basically a text. It's like her version of one of the lockdown texts, except it's interesting instead. Except, like, instead of being on, like, watching, like, reruns of Friends and like, watering your plants, it's like, you're downloading live leak gore videos compulsively and jacking off to hentai. And, which I think, like, I found, like, a really interesting and effective direct response to the Together in a Sudden Strangeness poems, as an image of how, like, precisely in this isolation that we've entered into to prevent death at the cost of intimacy, neither death nor intimacy go away. And they're both still with the character, but in the form of, again, like, sort of deranged fetish desires and, like, compulsive self-traumatizing and all these, like, gritty parts of, like, life online that, honestly, like, even as normie as all the poets in the pandemic book are, I would not be surprised if some of them are, like, looking up some weird hentai at the same time to deal with their like, sexual frustration in lockdown. Like, what's his name? The journalist, Kurt Eichenwald, who got, like, caught with, like, a hentai tab open in a screen cap in 2016, and, like, had to pretend he was looking it up to prove that tentacle porn exists to his wife. And just, they don't want to write poems about it because it's not what, like, fits the sort of definition or metaphor of poetry and the metaphor of quarantine. But, like, in a sense, I think that's a much, like, a sort of more raw and honest depiction of the pandemic and its defining paradox in relation to sort of intimacy and isolation and, of course, death, and all the sort of, essentially, the battalion, what all of that intersects on, which is essentially the battalion conception of the limit and the limit experience and the sort of dangers of the limit and the removal of the limit between the self and others, and eventually the protagonist, like, just gives in to this sort of death drive, becomes like a suicide bomber, to sort of, like, fully, like, just crash into this limit that's always with us as death, as isolation, as intimacy, as, like, all of these contradictions. And, yeah, no, I think that's probably my favorite contemporary COVID piece in a way. And yeah, you can go look it up on, it's on Neko Girl Magazine, nekogirlmagazine.com. Scroll down, it's in the first issue. Read the rest of the first issue, which is also like, in general, kind of a pandemic response. There's other pandemic pieces. It's called like Sick Long Before Any Virus Showed Up. Yeah. Anything else you want to say, or should we close it off?
I guess for a conclusion, what's it called? No, yeah, like I think what's more evident with the pandemic is that essentially it brought its own it brought its own sense of while it didn't fulfill all the apocalyptic prophecies of of Berardi or of people who want certain people to die, I guess. What it did do in particular is that it sort of became not a wake up call. It became something that made people a bit more aware of the kind of abstraction and precarity that has haunted the 2000s up until now, the very precarity that Gen X and millennials have found themselves in eventually, and the precarity that Gen Z has been born into, in a sense. And it's interesting to bring up the death and intimacy never went away, even if it was put at a distance. But that's just the exact thing, isn't it? It's just essentially their positions have now changed. That does not mean that they have been abolished. I mean, in the totality of the present, right? The present is essentially in a way an accumulation of different factors of life, of death, of intimacy, and not too much of it. And I think that with the more effective COVID poems, they understand that in a sense, but not in the kind of aphoristic way of of how a self-help guru kind of puts together oh, you just have to be in the now or whatever. But they're more able to encapsulate its spirit, its geist, so to speak.
Yeah.
With the raw reification that's possible through language, especially since we have mediums that reify and show affect, the visual or the audio, for example. But the thing with language is that it's not a medium that can directly append something in the sense of if you want to think of it like martial arts, it's one of those martial arts where you kind of give into the attack in a sense.
Yeah.
It's a bit.
It's more really nice
either
metaphor.
judo or even in this philosophy, sutemi waza, the idea of giving into the attack in order to create an opening of some kind, or even with just the way that people trade blows in martial arts, for example, where it's less to do with actually striking the opponent, but more being able to just counter and negotiate more similar to more like a dance. I mean, that's kind of the way that Wong Kar-wai's the Grandmaster looked at martial arts, and I think the same could be applied to writing in the way that it's not a medium that approaches these things directly. And as for writing about catastrophe, well, I mean, hey, it's happening right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we have some things like Frankenstein in Baghdad, for example, I haven't read it yet, but I know from you that it's a very good example of being able to write a catastrophe, especially given the constant state of war that ravages the Middle East. How it's intense and horrifying, but also strangely but also strangely banal and calm. Even B.R. Yeager's Amygdala Metropolis captures a very internal kind of catastrophe, recalling like one sort of disembodiment from spending like all your time on the Wired, like looking at gore videos and casual images of violence.
I wanted to say about Frankenstein in Baghdad, probably in general, much better writing about catastrophe is happening outside of, like, Canada and America and NATO countries. Like, but that's not an excuse for us as writers in the Imperial Corps to just, like, give up and declare, like, oh, I am not an essential service, so I'm just gonna, like, masturbate. Like, yeah, there are ways to write about our uniquely paradoxical position in these centers of the imperial economy that are, like, insulated from the catastrophe that we're sort of accelerating around the world in a lot of ways, and yet still exposed in others.
Even outside of the CIA-funded Iowa Writers' Workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, there's a point that we didn't touch on at all. This would be a pretty good conclusion. It's the Furious Vanguard, the Owl of Minerva, and the one time, and probably only time I'll ever bring up Zizek ever. I remember you brought it up.
Yeah. Yeah, like, sort of that on one hand, like, it might be just that we don't have much good COVID writing yet because the Owl of Minerva flies at dusk, like, thought tends to occur after the event, but on the other hand, like, there's also this idea of the theorist, of the poet as the unacknowledged legislator of humanity, as the philosopher, as the vanguard in the revolution making philosophy real, and, like, despite all the sort of, like, pessimism we've been sort of indulging in on this podcast, and, like, saying Berardi's pessimism doesn't go far enough, like, I think there is, like, a potential within literature to actually sort of seize the historical moment through language, as well as to comment on it in the aftermath. And we're just seeing the very beginnings of that, hopefully, and we're hopefully going to bring you some of that here at Andata Express, and let's all stay safe, and hope we weather this and
Stay
come out
safe,
stronger.
And be well. Also, could you check the stream real quick to see if anyone's commented? I mean, I highly doubt it, but just in case, like, somebody asked a question on it, that'd be kind of interesting.
I'm not seeing anything like that. We can add some materials on Twitter afterwards, and if there's anything we need to follow up on.
Thanks. Oh, question for you. Are you able to stop YouTube first?
You're still streaming, by the way. You're still streaming, just so you know. I'm just gonna let the song go for a bit. I'd just like to say thanks again to Mika, both for finding that ridiculous logo poem at considerable waste of time, and for writing Semtex ads at the back of children magazines and improving the general state of COVID poetics. Good luck on your current novel and many other endeavors. I'm going to end stream. Okay.